This module will cover the initial assessments that you can use to establish a benchmark for your students, as well as how to deliver the first few lesson plans. Be sure to follow along in your course manual in the Initial Assessments and Lesson Plans section. Though not necessary when delivering an Orton-Gillingham lesson, the initial assessment tools are valuable in establishing a baseline of information concerning your students, as well as assisting you with planning your future lessons. The same tools can be used throughout the year to monitor progress. We have included an informal coding assessment in this course that is recommended for use during the initial assessment, as well as throughout the year for progress monitoring. After you have administered the informal coding assessment, you can then establish your student's initial deck and complete the red word assessment. When working one-on-one with a student, you will use only the single consonants and vowels to establish your student's initial deck. You will first take these cards out of your phonogram deck. You will then be seated across from your student, ensuring your student can clearly see the phonogram cards. You will deliver a visual drill using the deck of single consonants and vowels that you have prepared. You can view more information about the visual drill along with demonstration videos in the visual drill module. During this time, you will create two piles. One pile of phonogram cards that your student knows visually, and a second pile of phonogram cards that your student does not know visually. The cards your student knows visually will be used to deliver the auditory drill. You will then deliver an auditory drill using the deck of single consonants and vowels that your student knows visually. You will again create two piles. One pile of phonogram cards that your student knows visually and auditorily, and a second pile of phonogram cards that your student knows visually but not auditorily. These cards that your student knows both visually and auditorily will be the deck that you use when you deliver the drill work during your first lesson. Any cards that your student does not know both visually and auditorily will need to be introduced in subsequent lessons. You will first introduce the cards that your student knows visually but not auditorily, and once all of those cards have been introduced, you will then introduce any cards that your student did not know visually. Keep in mind that you will only introduce one phonogram card at a time. Thus, as an example, if there were 3 single consonants that your student did not know, both visually and auditorily, during this initial assessment, then you will need to complete 3 subsequent lessons with this student to teach each of these phonemes prior to moving on to column 3 of the suggested order. If you are working in a whole group setting, then you can use the informal coding assessment results to pinpoint any single consonants and short vowels you may need to introduce to your class prior to beginning column 3 of the suggested order to present phonemes, rules, and patterns. Ultimately, you need to ensure that your whole group knows all of the single consonants and short vowels prior to moving on to the next column. Please keep in mind that you may not fully understand how to deliver the drill work and establish this deck until after you have completed the drill work modules later in this course. If you find that this presentation is confusing without further information, please feel free to circle back to review this presentation after you have completed the rest of the course. After you have completed the initial assessments, you are ready to begin with your first lesson. During this lesson, there will be no old review, as you have not introduced anything new to your student. Typically, the old review is a review of the material that you taught 2 lessons prior, as well as anything that your student had difficulty with during the previous lesson. The new review is a review of the material that you taught during the previous lesson. Again, because you have not taught anything new to your student, there will be no review. This lesson will begin with the drill work. Be sure that you have worked through the remainder of this course prior to beginning with your students. After you have delivered the visual drill, auditory drill, and blending drill to your student using the initial deck that you established during the initial assessment, you are ready to introduce something new to your student. Again, you will only introduce one phoneme, rule, or concept to your student in each lesson. If the student knew all of the single consonants and short vowels during the initial assessment, then you are ready to begin with the first lesson at the top of column 3 of the suggested order to present phonemes, rules, and patterns. After you have introduced something new to your student, you will then move on to the spelling portion of the lesson. During this portion, you will provide your student with a few words, phrases, or sentences to spell, making certain that the material you provide only contains the consonants and vowels the student already knows, including the new sound, rule, or concept that you taught during this lesson. Be sure to incorporate fingerspelling during this portion of the lesson. You will learn more about fingerspelling in the spelling module. You will then progress to the reading portion of the lesson. During this portion of the lesson, you will provide your student with a few sentences or a short passage to read, making certain that all of the material you provide only contains the consonants and vowels your student already knows, including the new sound, rule, or concept that you taught during this lesson. You can encourage the student to read the sentences or passage more than once for added fluency practice, and be sure to provide comprehension questions to check for understanding. After you have finished the reading portion of the lesson, you will then move on to the non-phonetic words portion of the lesson. The next slide will cover how to deliver the red word assessment to your student. During the red word portion of the first lesson, you will assess the student's knowledge of non-phonetic sight words. You will first ask your students to read a few words from the first column. You will then ask your students to spell the words they were able to read correctly. You will continue this process until you have compiled a list of 3 to 5 words that your students are able to read but not spell. These will be your students' first red words. Be sure to place a check mark in the appropriate box next to the words your students already know. If you are working one-on-one, then you will have a red word checklist for each student. If you are working in a whole group setting, this assessment may be challenging to utilize. It is recommended that you begin with the first 5 red words and move on to the next 5 when you are ready to retire the first list. You will work on the same red words until your students have spelled the red words correctly in 7 to 10 subsequent lessons. During each lesson, you will ask your students to spell the red words, and each correctly spelled red word receives a check mark. You will do this during each lesson until one or more of the red words has 7 to 10 check marks. You are then ready to retire those red words and add new red words. If there are red words that your students are having difficulty with, you can add kinesthetic practice during this portion of the lesson to practice those red words. Again, you will not retire these words until your students have spelled them correctly 7 to 10 times. If you are working with older students, 5 to 7 subsequent lessons may suffice. During the second lesson, after the initial assessments, there will not be an old review. The old review is a review of the material you taught 2 lessons back. At this point, you have only had 1 lesson after the initial assessments, so there will be no old review. The new review will consist of material that you taught during the previous lesson. During the third lesson after the initial assessments, you will begin to have both old and new review. The old review will consist of material taught during lesson number 1, along with anything with which your student had difficulty during the previous lesson. The new review will be a review of the material taught during lesson number 2. The review portion of the lesson will follow this pattern as you progress through the suggested order to present phonemes, rules, and patterns. Your old review will always consist of material you taught 2 lessons back, as well as anything with which your student had difficulty during the previous lesson. Your new review will always consist of material you taught during the previous lesson. A good Orton-Gillingham practitioner will always edit the lesson plan. We have provided you with completed lesson plans that you can use to deliver Orton-Gillingham lessons to your students. Whether you utilize our lesson plans or create your own, it is always a good idea to edit the lesson plan to ensure that it meets the needs of your student or group. Before the lesson, follow these steps. Make sure your lesson has a review of the material you have recently taught, and ensure that you've included any areas of difficulty during this time. Be sure that you have allotted equal time for all parts of the lesson. Always plan to incorporate all sensory pathways throughout the lesson. And be sure that your reading and spelling material only includes sounds, rules, and concepts that you have already introduced to your students. Be prepared to assist your students if they come across words or phonemes that have not been introduced. After your lesson, follow these steps. As a reflective practitioner, it is important to assess each lesson, making note of the student's areas of strength and weakness. Appropriate documentation of this diagnostic information is essential for driving future lessons. How did your student perform during this lesson? Were you able to get through the entire lesson? Did you plan appropriately for this lesson? Did you have all of the supplies that you needed to deliver a successful lesson? How can you improve future lessons based on this information? Please note that it is okay to divert away from the lesson when necessary to address any unforeseen difficulties your student may be having. This is a list of items that you will need with you when you teach. If you are working with a whole group, it will be important that each student in your group has the appropriate supplies. As the teacher, you will want to ensure that you have your lesson plan with you, along with your phonogram deck, any reading material that you are providing during this lesson, and your current RedWord note cards. You will also want to ensure that you have a writing utensil for making note of diagnostic information throughout the lesson. Your students will need to have paper, student recording sheets, or the student workbook in front of them throughout the lesson. They will also need tactile surfaces for kinesthetic and tactile practice, writing utensils for the auditory drill and spelling portions of the lesson, and a red pen or pencil for RedWord practice. During the lesson, be sure to avoid distractions as much as possible. It is a good idea to watch the time during your lesson to avoid spending too much or too little time on one portion of the lesson. Ensure that your supplies are easily accessible to avoid causing delays throughout the lesson. Be sure to give your students ample positive reinforcement throughout the lesson. If your students are working on an erasable surface, such as an iPad or a wipe-off board, be sure to record errors to ensure that you are adding these concepts to your old review during the next lesson. Always be sure that the material provided is fair for your students, and that the reading and spelling material only contains phonemes and concepts that you have already taught. Finally, use all modalities of learning in every lesson. Students should see it, hear it, feel it, and say it correctly before you move on to something new. When first starting out, it is a good idea to print, laminate, and cut out the new teacher aids. You can hole punch the corner of each aid and place them on a ring to carry with you each time you teach. On this slide, you will see the visual drill aid, auditory drill aid, and an introduction of new phonogram aid. These aids list the steps you will follow during that portion of the lesson. There are also aids for assessing and introducing new red words, as well as aids for introducing a new syllable pattern or division rule. Eventually, you will not need these aids as the structure of the lesson becomes more automatic for you. This concludes the initial assessments and lesson plans presentation. We hope this presentation helps you as you prepare to meet with your students for the first time.